a key part of the Arctic National Strategy that we wrote, I talked about the funding structures. But the other thing is the government needs a holistic strategy. It needs a holistic strategy for dealing with for the future of the Arctic, for ensuring prosperity, economic development, environmental sustainability, reconciliation, all of those key issues. We don't have one.
Welcome, Tom, to the podcast. I would love for you to take a second and sort of introduce yourself. And over to you.
Sure. So my name's Tom Henheffer. I am the CEO at the Arctic Research Foundation, and I live in Toronto. I'm originally from the East Coast. I was born in St. John's and raised in St. John, New Brunswick, or just outside St. John in a place called Quispamsis. And my background is actually, I'm a journalist by trade. I went to university in Fredericton, St. Thomas University, got a degree in journalism and human rights, and I always joked that it'd be the most useless degree, but then I managed to get a job at Maclean's magazine, which is why I ended up moving to Toronto, because I met the editor-in-chief at the time, Ken White, at an event at the university that they were putting on, and then at a bar afterwards. And I guess I impressed him, because I wound up moving there with just a suitcase that I could fit on the plane with 1 week's notice, and slept. I knew one guy in the city. I slept on his floor, his hardwood floor. I thought he might have an extra blanket or an extra towel or something, but he had one blanket, one pillow, one towel, one bed. So I slept on the floor the first night with my my jacket under my head and some clothes piled up on top of me. Didn't really get much sleep. And then the next day was a holiday. It was a May long weekend. It was actually, I would have moved here just over in 2009. So like 15 years ago. I had to go out to everything was closed because it was a holiday. So I had to walk up and down Yonge Street to try and find like a tourist store that was open to buy a pillow and a blanket. But anyway, then from there, I was an editor at the Toronto Star. I started my own company, freelancing and doing videography and just reporting. And I also started a camera parts manufacturing company where I got a patent for something, never made any money at it, lost money. But then I made my way into working in human rights. So I actually used both sides of my degree, which was nice. I was the executive director at an organization called Canadian Journalists for Free Expression, where we did a lot of cool work, getting Mohamed Fahmy out of jail in Egypt, or helping to get Mohamed Fahmy out of jail in Egypt, helping to overturn Bill C-51, which was the kind of Harper surveillance bill. It was called the Canadian Patriot Act, is how a lot of people refer to it. Helping to get new democratic elections in Croatia, where there was there was kind of fascist, like literal fascist elements within. They were members of the Ustašakt, which was a fascist organization in Croatia that were in the government, and they were cracking down on journalism. So it was part of a UN mission. We went over there and held a press conference and kind of did a bunch of lobbying to try and push things. And then a little while later, the minority party that was propping up the government withdrew their support, and there were elections. So that was great work. And then from there, I went into political consulting, and from political consulting, I wound up in this job as I started out as vice president communications at the Arctic Research Foundation, and I've just my role has grown since.
I am just blown away, first of all, that you started out as a journalist. And one of the sort of media organizations that you touched along your professional journey was Vice. And I was actually really interested in Vice because I come from like a branding and design background. And I was really curious about, the name of Vice came from the word voice, and they removed the O. I think I remember something like that. I don't know if that's true. Is that a myth?
Oh, I actually didn't know that. Yeah, well, I mean, I was long when I was there. It was long after the days of Gavin Crawford and some of the original the Shane Smith was the other guy who's still who was running it for a while and left a few years ago. But I wasn't there very long. I was only because I started. They brought me into kind of after I was at CJFE, they brought me in to kind of help professionalize the newsroom, or maybe not. It was already fairly professional, but to bring a different perspective. But within a month of starting there, the sexual assault scandal broke about there being a number of kind of their leadership being involved in a number of some pretty bad behavior. And then the initial public offering fell through. And then I basically was told, instead of, helping to grow the newsroom and make sure it grew professionally, I was told to kind of come up with a list of people to fire. And that's when I made my exit fairly quickly. So I wasn't there for very long.
My sister also studied human rights and journalism from Carleton University in Ottawa.
Oh, cool.
My dad's a journalist as well. We've been a journalist his whole life. So I do understand the life of a journalist and sort of...
It's tough. And I mean, part of the reason why I've had the career that I have is because pretty soon after I graduated university, I always had wanted to be a journalist. I read Michael Herr and Hannah Arendt and Hunter S. Thompson, the old cliche, Tom Wolfe, the new journalists. But it was really the Vietnam World War II journalists that made me want to get into it. But I realized graduating university in 2009 and coming in, that was kind of the first, 2008, 2009 was kind of the first big collapse of journalism in Canada. And there's been several since. And it's every time you think that it can't get any worse, it seems to continue to get worse. But it did create opportunities for young people coming out of university to get these jobs because people were fired and they wanted cheap people who could work really cheaply. So there were a few openings at that time, but it was really obvious to me that the industry was on a severe downward trend. And even when I was at CJFE, that organization, it still does really awesome work, but it's mostly pro bono stuff done through the courts and raising awareness about issues and working with the Journalists in Distress Fund. They don't do nearly as much advocacy in Canada outside of the courts and raising awareness through their gala, just because their funders, who are media organizations, don't have the money to do it anymore. So it was fairly obvious to me fairly early on that was going to be a problem, which is part of the reason why I transitioned from journalism into CJFE, because it was a nonprofit, free expression nonprofit, but that dealt with primarily dealt with journalists. So it was a way to kind of have both feet, or one foot in the journalism world and one foot out. And then I thought that would be a way to transition long term, which is exactly what wound up happening. I mean, I didn't start at CJFE thinking that I was going to be leaving CJFE, but I knew that it would give me more options.
What I want to go back to is, you were like sort of the decline of journalism, and there's a lot of because I listen to a lot of the subculture, like podcasts and other content, and I don't primarily listen to the mainstream media. And there's this world divided between, the journalism going to shit, blah, blah, blah. So you mentioned that, at that point it started to decline. Were there certain events that happened according to you? What was happening?
At that point, probably what's most illustrative of it was when I was there, I think there were somewhere between 30 and 60 people in the newsroom at Maclean's when I was there in 2009. And now I think that's one or two. And it doesn't publish the magazine anymore, and it stopped publishing years ago. The Toronto Star, when I was an editor there, had an enormous newsroom, and now it's a shell of itself. When I was growing up in St. John, the Telegraph Journal was a nationally respected, it was in a small city on the East Coast, but it had some incredible journalists. It was known for really excellent reporting. But when I would go back to visit my parents in Quispamsis, they'd get the Telegraph Journal, and especially even, I don't even think they get it anymore, but when they did, you'd see it was just wire copy. The entire thing was just wire copy. There was they had maybe one reporter in the city, and you've seen that everywhere. Budgets have and part of that around the time when I was at Maclean's and the Toronto Star, that was when Star Touch, they were trying to come up with this tablet edition. And a big part of the problem was that there was just a real failure to innovate in journalism. And when big investments, hundreds of millions of dollars of investments, went into innovation, it was a lot of the time for projects that were never going to work. Star Touch was never going to work. It was always going to fail. It was trying to replicate, I think, what Le Devoir or one of the Quebec newspapers did, but they stopped their print edition. The Toronto Star tried to have a print and a tablet edition. And tablets tablets are people... maybe people high up in these organizations, they and their friends all have tablets, but a lot of people just don't use them that much. So it was a bit of a failure to innovate, a bit of when the internet came along, everybody gave away their content for free. So people expected it to be free. They didn't expect it to be paywalled. So you had to kind of adjust people's behavior. And as you know, in marketing, it's a lot harder to adjust an ingrained behavior once it has been ingrained. And then also Facebook and Google kind of eating everybody's lunch, having that content, but then not contributing to the revenue. So, and the Canadian government has tried to change that by bringing in these new requirements that they actually pay a certain percentage of their revenue is taxed and given out to grants to news organizations. But it's a bit of too little, too late, and you see. It's so important that you have reporters covering issues. You can't just parachute in. You need to have sources. You need to know police officers who can tell you the kind of behind the scenes stuff, what's going on. If you're a Metro reporter, you need to know staff at city council who can tell you the realities of what's going on, and not having, small towns, they used to all have their own reporters, a handful of reporters in every town. Now you'll have one reporter for huge regions, if that. And so town councils, city councils are getting away with murder, like not literally murder, but with huge amounts of corruption. And there's a lot of issues that are cropping up that we don't even know about because there aren't reporters kind of shining sunlight and making sure. It's called the fifth estate for a reason. It's the fifth pillar of a democracy, or the fourth pillar of a democracy, you need that for a country like Canada to function properly. And honestly, I think it's really quite scary and dangerous what's happening, because you can't, podcasts, and there is some excellent journalism and really great investigative journalism being done in the podcast world, but it's a drop in a bucket compared to what we used to have even 15, 20 years ago in journalism in the country. And that's not compared to, back in the 70s and the 80s and before then, when journalism was really at its heyday. The salaries for journalists today are not even adjusted for inflation, just in pure actual money, is about the same as they were in 1970, which is crazy. Like if you were making $80,000 as a reporter in 1970, you're making $80,000 as a reporter now, and that actually a lot of the union salaries top out at 80, 90, maybe 100, and that's for people who've been working in this for years and years and years and years and years, and that's not enough to buy a house in Toronto, at least not on a single income, and not. Which is messed up. It's such a valuable service, but the economic model just doesn't work. It's moved on, and we failed to adjust. And now we're trying to play catch up, but it's going to be in a world of that requires, under our system, exponential growth in a finite system. You're not going to get that kind of thing. Vice, I think, was kind of the last big example where people thought that, they were going to have this big IPO. They were going to get this huge injection of cash that was going to allow them to create a new model for journalism, because they were never profitable. But they had, that's how it works with IPOs. And I think the market has cooled on them a little bit because people have realized how massively overvalued things are. But it was when Vice IPO fell through because of the sexual assault scandal breaking, and probably other reasons too. But I can't. Those two things were so close together. I can't imagine that didn't impact. But to be clear, I don't know. But that's just kind of my assumption. That was the last. I think that was kind of the death knell for the big investment companies, hedge funds, for investing in journalism. I think that's when they realized, you know what, this isn't going to work. And unfortunately, so much for generating cash for new ventures and injecting cash into new ventures. A lot of the time, they come from that world. So it's been very difficult for journalism. Lost a lot, and it's going to have a really hard time getting back to where it was. And I don't think it ever will. Sort
of the sentiment that you touched on is something that my dad constantly expresses. Is that journalists have always been the watchdogs for democracy, and and they're also kind of all that stuff that you were talking about. The stingers, the people who are plugged into different parts of sort of society who bring back this information, and reporters rely so heavily on them. The whole business model falling out of the bottom. A lot of this top-down thinking, not thinking about the reader first, which is very typical of a lot of that explains a lot of the bad decisions that have been made.
You had 60-year-old guys pitching new technology to 80-year-old guys, hoping that 20-year-old people were going to use it, and it's not. That's not how it works.
Exactly. I feel like and plus now, if I look at the macro view, like most of the organizations, initially, from what I understand, were like sort of these independent voices, but now they're just owned by these large corporate organizations. And
yeah, my thesis in university was actually on. My journalism thesis was on the concentration of media ownership and how dangerous that is. And I would have written that in 2008 and 2009. And it was really bad then. Now, Post Media owns like every single, it used to be really bad that in New Brunswick, all the newspapers except for one small newspaper, Acadie Nouvelle, was owned by the Irvings. And that was a big problem. And it definitely impacted coverage in that province. And then Post Media came along and they bought up all the papers, and they own almost every local paper. And they're not, it's not like they're coming in and injecting new life into these papers. They're kind of hacking and slashing in a lot of instances, and it's really bad. And like for instance, one thing that's really important and that we're very lucky to have is a public broadcaster. You need obviously, depending on what country you're in and what the rules are, a state broadcaster or state journalism can be a serious problem because that's just a mouthpiece. You've got that with like Pravda in Russia or every news agency in China. But a public broadcaster and a state broadcaster are two very different things. A public broadcaster is arm's length, and that's why it's great that we have CBC because it's a service. It's like the post office. It's not. There's been a lot of complaints about the post office losing money lately, but the post office it's a government service. It's not really meant to generate revenue for the government in the same way that CBC is not meant to generate revenue for the government. A big problem is that CBC sells ads. They have a mandate to sell ads, but they get money from the federal government to run, and they need the money from the federal government to run, but they subsidize that with ads. So basically they used to get more money, they didn't sell ads, and then the government said, we're going to give you less money, but you can sell ads to make up the difference. The problem is that means that their advertising rates can undercut all of the other private journalism outlets. Basically the Globe and Mail and the Toronto Star are kind of some of the only ones out there. So their ad revenue is lower than what it should be because CBC can sell all of these ads on their website, especially the web ads is where you really see it, and CBC is subsidized by the government. So it should happen, what the government should be doing to really benefit journalism in Canada is give CBC enough money to operate without having to sell ads, make it so they can no longer sell ads. I don't know if you've ever watched CBC Jim, but it is unwatchable. It is ungoddamn watchable because they have these ads. They'll run 5 or 6 of the same ads in a row of exactly the same 30-second ad that you have to watch over and over and over again to try and boost the revenue number. I don't know why the UI is, or why they have so many problems with it, but it's terrible. So my wife and I will not watch CBC Gem anymore because the advertising is so frustrating in it. But that's beside they're not doing it well is my point, but they're doing it well enough to undercut other organizations. So if CBC is out of the ad game, that gives more revenue to organizations like the Globe and Mail and Toronto Star, and that would benefit journalism in Canada massively. But in order for that to happen, the federal government needs to invest more in CBC. Right? You can't have one without the other. If they just say no more selling ads, then CBC is in real trouble. But so that's one of the unique instances in Canada. That's kind of a unique problem to us, is that we have a public broadcaster, but its ad sales are undercutting our private journalism outlets.
Without getting into the politics of it, because I'm totally apolitical. Personally, but I've heard a lot of conversation around from Pierre Poilievre, whatever. He's like
Poilievre.
Sorry, my bad. Thank you for correcting me there. Polyev.
No problem. It's a hard name to spell and
Right,
pronounce.
Polyev. And he keep talking about that the media is owned by Justin Trudeau, and it's a mouthpiece of the government. And fair enough. Of course, he's an opponent. He's going to say a whole bunch of stuff too. But the point really here is the concept that he talks about is like, why have it subsidized and let them just make money through revenue and just be out there in sort of like a capitalist kind of environment?
I have an answer for that, which is that as we discussed, journalists are in many ways the defender of democracy. And I mean, journalists are flawed human people like everyone else, but you need someone watching City Hall. You have to have someone watching City Hall. There is not enough money for that now. The journalism industry has failed in Canada and is a shell of its former self. And we've got pretty much the Globe and Mail, the Toronto Star, which is nothing like it used to be, and even the Globe and Mail has really shrunk, and CBC. If we're going to have journalists holding the government accountable, we need the CBC. And the idea that the CBC is a mouthpiece of the government is outrageously false. It is so completely untrue. CBC is so afraid, and I worked very closely with people in CBC for a very long time. They are so afraid of being labeled as having a liberal bias that they will almost always err on the side of being very conservative, or at least being more neutral than they should be when there's like a very clear answer to some question, but it might be on the liberal side of things. They'll give space to someone opposing it, even if they have like no grounding in fact whatsoever. Sometimes, so there is no liberal bias at the CBC. If anything, there's a conservative bias because they're afraid of being labeled. They're exactly afraid of this kind of thing. And the fact is, it can't compete in the free market. It just can't. And the free market, we don't really have a free market in Canada to begin with. It's one thing to have, however you feel about socialism, the social welfare state. I think most people generally agree that we shouldn't be socializing corporations. But we do live in a country where, Air Canada gets, they fail and fail and fail again, and the government bails them out. We have the subprime mortgage crisis hit Canada, not as hard as the States, but economically it did, and corporations were bailed out. Corporations were bailed out during COVID, and I think the COVID was a little bit different because there was a lot of gap loans and things like that to keep businesses running, ARF included actually, and we benefited from that. That's a little bit different, but oftentimes there's big bailouts for these companies that the government will do. So it's not like we're really living in a truly Smithian economics, free hand of the market anyway. The government's coming in and interfering and helping out the big established players rather than allowing the market to correct for itself. So, but the fact is, if we allow journalism to just exist in the free market when it has failed, there needs to be federal support for this to happen. There just does. There isn't enough money in the market. There isn't a model that works to generate it. The New York Times is successful because they have such a huge subscriber base. I subscribe to the New York Times, right? I also subscribe to Canadian outlets, but the New York Times, because it's international, it has a huge audience. The Hamilton Spectator doesn't have that audience, and it never will. And the way that it works, if you don't want people getting all of their news off of Twitter, and even if people are going to get all the news off of Twitter, but if you want some organizations with reliable actual journalists who are following the principles of objectivity and doing their research and investigating, you want them publishing the narrative to at least counterbalance some of the crazier stuff that's out there on social media. So in that sense, yeah, we need there needs to be government support for this.
By the way, I agree with you on a couple of those fronts. And in fact, there's I think there's another sort of marketing person I follow, Rory Sutherland, and he was talking about, maybe, for example, Twitter has, or X or whatever, has some sort of a model where you have like money sitting in that account. And then every time you want to read an article, you just say, okay, I'll pay for this. And you pay like 50 cents or $1 for the article that you want to read.
Micropayments. That's something that they've been talking about implementing since back when I first started in journalism, and no one's successfully done it.
Yeah, of course.
It's a good idea, but no one successfully implemented it.
I would also argue that a lot of the tech and solutions, sometimes they were, from a timing perspective, maybe too early. Maybe there are some new models to be explored.
But when you talk about that micropayment thing, you talk about, on Twitter, if someone goes and clicks clicks on an article and they get a little balance taken out of them, or on Facebook, someone goes in and gets it, or on Google, they go in and they get it and a little thing comes out. That's essentially what the government subsidy for media, not with the CBC, but the other subsidy, the tax on Facebook and Google and Twitter, on social media platforms. That's essentially what that's doing. Is it's saying like, you're generating a certain percentage of your traffic because of these online articles that people are clicking through, and you're generating revenue off of ad sales for that. So you've got to share some of your ad revenue with these media sources. And the thing is, the companies will not do that on their own, because Facebook said, Google agreed, what the government said, we are doing this, we're going to force you to do this. If you want to exist in Canada, you have to comply with this. Google agreed. I'm not sure where Twitter is on it. And I'm not going to call it X. I don't care what Elon Musk wants. It's Twitter to me. But Facebook freaked out and said, all right, if you're going to make us pay this, we're not doing it. We're going to delist all news in Canada. So if you're a news organization in Canada, you are no longer on Facebook. They kicked all of them off of Facebook. So it's the idea that like you're right, that's a model that could work, but there's no economic incentive for the companies to do it, because they're already getting they're right now getting all of the money from the ad sales that the content from news sites are generating on their platforms. They don't want to share it. And if you want a perfect example of what it looks like when they're kind of made to share it, Facebook picked up their ball and went home. Right? They said, if you're going to make us do this, we're so opposed to giving even a tiny, just a tiny pittance of a percentage of the profits they're making in Canada, an absolutely infinitesimally small amount of it to share as a profit sharing revenue. Instead, they just delisted all the news websites. So the idea that the free market is going to provide for that it hasn't. And when the government came up with a solution that would work, Facebook said no, and took a pretty extreme measure to do it.
We're in a world of I try to go deep. I'm really generally very curious, come from a place of inquiry and try to learn different perspectives. And you typically end up hearing one perspective and you're like, okay, let me find the opposite of this. So that's why that was actually really helpful.
Oh, and one other key thing is that Google, I think part of the reason why Google Canada, and I don't know if he's still there, but he was their head of communications when I was at CJFE, and I think he was promoted pretty high up. He might even be, I think he was running all of Google Canada at the time. His name's Aaron Brindle, and he was a journalist. So it's not surprising that Google Canada agreed to participate, because they happen to have a journalist very highly placed in the organization, a former journalist. If it wasn't, something tells me, now again, this is pure speculation on my part. I have no idea whether this is fully true or not. I just know that there was a guy high placed at Google that was a journalist, and Facebook didn't participate, but Google did. And something tells me that Google probably would have been a lot less likely to if it wasn't for someone advocating for this inside, assuming that happened. Again, I don't actually know if that's the case, but that's what my gut tells me.
I would say that's such a great example of having diversity of thought and perspective in the leadership on your business, because now they can understand and have empathize and see, otherwise if somebody's not a journalist, they don't get it. They don't understand the value of finding all that stuff that you were talking about earlier in the conversation.
So that's a core principle at ARF, and what I know that segues are important in podcasts, and I figure you're probably about to do that. But yeah, the diversity of thought in leadership and diversity of perspective and background is really, really crucially important. And that's a principle that's very close to our heart, and that has been a big help in making ARF successful.
One of your latest articles that you have up on your the ARF website. Actually, hold on. Why don't you give the elevator pitch of what this Artic ARF Foundation is?
Yeah, the Arctic Research Foundation, or ARF, sometimes also called ARF, is a yeah. I know it sounds like a dog barking. It's a good acronym, but our brand is a polar bear, not a dog, so that's why I say ARF. Right. We could have used a husky, but the polar bear is much more of an iconic Arctic symbol. We were founded a little over a decade ago to help in the search for the Franklin expedition ships. We did about 80% of the search for the Erebus, and then thanks to our community first approach, our former CEO at the time got to know a hunter trapper from the community of Johaven who knew where the HMS Terror was located. The Inuit have known where the HMS Terror is for a long time. It wasn't a recent discovery. It was discovered by Southern people. The Inuit are the ones who did it, and he trusted ARF to enough to tell us the story of him finding the ship. He found a mast sticking out of the ice, and he led our ship, the Martin Bergman, to the HMS Terror site. So our ship was the one that's accredited with the discovery. But again, the Inuit are the ones who discovered it. So while we were doing that, what the organization, what we do today is essentially we exist to do good in the North by facilitating community-led science, economic development, infrastructure, and cultural projects. And so what happened, how we got to that point is our board realized back when they were doing the search for the Franklin, that there was a real lack of infrastructure, of research infrastructure in the Arctic, a serious lack of it, especially when it comes to near-shore marine research. So our bread and butter of everyday work is our fleet of ships. We've got 5 right now. It kind of expands and contracts depending on what projects we have. We've had 7 previously, and we're looking at purchasing some new ships. So we might be back up to 7 again soon. They've ranged in size from a little over 20 feet to 160, 170 feet. And our workhorse ships are about 60 feet, the former fishing vessels that have been kitted out to be research ships. And our niche is we're the only organization in Canada that has a fleet of Arctic capable near shore focused research vessels. So they have shallow drafts so they can get right up against the shore, which is where communities are. It's where they hunt. It's where they fish. It's where they transit. It's where the rivers and where the lakes flow into the sea. So it's a really scientifically, culturally, economically, it's one of the most important and one of the most understudied areas, because a lot of research in Canada traditionally has been done for big icebreakers, and they have to stay out really far from shore in the really deep water because they have very deep drafts. They can't get it within miles of shore in a lot of cases, and only about 10% of the Arctic of Arctic waters is actually mapped or mapped to modern standards. So there's a real need for moving beyond the big ships into doing smaller work. But in addition to that, we do a lot of terrestrial work. We have mobile labs that are built out of shipping containers that are powered by wind and solar. We have the furthest north wind and solar array in Canada in Johaven, powering our Narvik project, Narvik is Inuktitut for the growing place, and it is a partnership with the community of Johaven as well as Agriculture Canada, Canadian Space Agency, and the National Research Council, and it is basically an agricultural grow pod. So containerized agriculture, farming inside, that's powered with wind and solar, and it's all done with Inuit technicians from the community. So I believe we've got 6 technicians right now. It goes between kind of 5 and 8, all permanently employed by the foundation, who are Inuit farmers, some of the first Inuit farmers in the country, because that's not something that culturally, generally, they had much of a history of. But with the realities of, food scarcity in the North, $14 for a head of lettuce that's half rotten by the time it gets to the shelves up there because it comes up on sea lifts or planes. This can really subsidize the diet in terms of needs for fresh food. So we do that. Their labs are modular. They can be used for anything. From one in Inuvik is used for storing human medical samples, water samples, and dentistry. It's got a dentist chair built in. We've got ones in Cambridge Bay that are used for sun tracking, for testing the thermal tolerance of char out on the ice in Finlayson Island. A whole bunch of different stuff. But key thing is it's community led. We go into communities when we're invited, spend time there, earn people's trust, find out what their priorities are, and then build networks, whether that be with university researchers, other research institutions, nonprofits, government departments, international organizations like the National Geographic or NASA or the Stockholm Resilience Center. We work with them to address those priorities, find funding, build projects, and go in and do the science that the community wants, amongst other projects. And that's really what we do. And then we also, our website is a publishing platform. So it's arcticfocus.org. And we basically use it to tell stories from the North. I like to say that, we never speak for Northerners, whether they be Inuit, Northern Indigenous, or anyone else, but we'll do everything that we can to amplify their voices. So we hire freelancers, as many from the North and as many Indigenous as we can, to write stories on climate change, on animal health, on cultural practices, on politics, and then publish that on the website. And we actually get over 1 million impressions a quarter through our website and social media channels, which is pretty huge. We had very rapid growth for a while, but we found that I think we've more or less kind of saturated the market. So we're more working on maintaining our audience and engaging them rather than growing it now. But through that, we also host the Arctic Research Database, which is the first Canada-wide free data-agnostic repository for primary Arctic research, and we're using it to test interoperability. So we're working with a consortium of organizations to bring standards into Arctic data. It's long, complicated technical stuff, but basically means we want to make sure that all of the data works together so you can use big data, get the big data sets, and really understand the ecosystem across time and across regions. It's very challenging, but that's a lot of work that we do, and we all do a lot of advocacy on as well. So we wrote the Arctic National Strategy, which is an implementation plan for Canada's Arctic and Northern Policy Framework. But basically, I go to Ottawa, meet with politicians, and try to get them to spend more time and energy addressing the serious needs in the Arctic, because the scale of investment from the federal government, although it's improving, is too small, and the structures that the government uses, whether they be for funding or for consultations or a whole bunch of other things, are all based on the South and the way of doing things in the South. And the realities of living in the North, they're very different, and they just don't work. They don't work as well. Like traveling to the Arctic, for anyone who hasn't been there, culturally, it's more different than traveling to Western Europe. It's more like it'd be more like traveling to Asia. And I don't mean that in the sense that the culture in the Arctic is more Asian. I mean, within our own country, the culture in the Arctic is so different. The south of Canada is very much a kind of Western European influence in a lot of ways. And the North is very different from that way of life. So it's more within, if you think of the similarities between Canada and Western Europe and the differences between Canada and Asia, it would be more, I'm just saying that the differences are more like that. Within our own country, it's extremely different. So we need to have an approach that is built by and for those communities.
Literally everything that we were talking about in the first half of the conversation ties so beautifully to the second half of the conversation. And let me share my unpolished version of this. Is if we think about all the things that we were talking about, what makes journalism great is kind of what you're doing in this foundation. Is you're firstly, go talk to the reader, go talk and plug into the local communities, understand the world from their perspective. And it's not like this top down sort of, it's bottom up.
And that top down is how science was traditionally done in Canada, and that's changing. It's called there's a few different terms for it: two-eyed seeing, knowledge braiding, the cogeneration of knowledge framework. Those are kind of the three ideas that you're building it with the community, for the communities, with the communities, with community leadership, and that's how these things need to be done. But we're in a privileged position. We were founded by our board gives us financial support, and we were founded by some Southern Ontario business people who were interested in the Arctic and are in a position to support us. Now we bring in funds, cost recovery through loaning out the ships. Like that's kind of how our economic model works. We have the core funds to keep the organization going, but then we go out to find project specific funding to get the ships out, to do these youth elder camps on the land with communities, to do all that work. But it's to just start an organization out of scratch without any funding secured is very difficult. It's very, very difficult.
When I went through the ARF site, I did see that, ex Blackberry CEO. By the way, is he anything like what they portrayed in the movie? Or
No, not at all. No, I work very closely with Jim. He is nothing like that. I don't even think I've ever really seen him raise his voice. He's a brilliantly intelligent and very intense guy, but nothing like that movie. I mean, they had the, like, to give you an idea of how inaccurate that movie was. They had, at one point, they had the SEC show up to BlackBerry headquarters in black vans to raid them. The SEC is an American securities regulator. They don't have any jurisdiction in Canada. So they would never be able. It was the Ontario Security Commission that was involved with BlackBerry, and they never showed up. There was never any point where they showed up in black SUVs. It was all done in boardrooms through lawyers. There was no raid, like none of that. It was very inaccurate. No, but the foundation was founded by Jim and another Southern Ontario businessman named Tim McDonald, and I meet with them very frequently to discuss strategy and things like that. They're very involved in the workings of ARF, but they don't like to be. That's why I didn't mention them, because they don't like to be in the spotlight.
Fair enough. Yeah.
They like to do things from behind the scenes, and it's. So yeah, the movie's not at all accurate. Although I got to say, Glenn Howard, and I'm a fan of his, and his performance was great.
Now that sort of bleeds into sort of that next piece that where we started the conversation, is that where I saw you go into with ministries and fisheries, where you're trying to get some of these government officials to understand, hey, it's not like the South. The North is completely different.
Yeah,
and they're talking about data, and you're like, but wait. You're kind of playing like this chicken and egg problem. I would love to sort of understand from your perspective, having been in all these different war rooms or discussions and conversations, what is it about what you're doing that, firstly, that the government bureaucrats and people in suits don't understand? And then second piece of that is, what is the normal public doesn't understand? And then how can they help?
Here's the one core issue that I think has really made it difficult, and there's several things, but I think that in terms of the politics of it, the biggest issue is this: there's one seat for the Northwest Territories, there's one seat for Nunavut, and I believe there's one for the Yukon as well. So maximum of 3 MPs in the North. For all the population just isn't very dense. There isn't a lot of votes there. The government, they care about reconciliation, they care about climate change. And the Arctic is a huge part of that. It's warming 4 to 6 times faster than the rest of the world, and the devastation is incredible. Like houses or communities where houses are burned down at one point in the summer, and then a massive flood comes at later on in the summer in the same year. That had never happened before. Tuktoyaktuk in 10 years may not exist. It's literally falling into the sea because the permafrost that it's built on is melting. The last time I was in Johaven, there was a windstorm overnight, and the hydro poles, instead of just a pretty intense windstorm, but for there just a normal Tuesday basically, and but the hydro poles all had fallen over like this, and we're at a really steep angle, which is really dangerous. And they were because they're just it's desert up there. It's sand in Johaven when it's not covered in snow, and they're just drilled 6 feet into the permafrost in the same way in the South that they're 6 feet into clay or whatever or the shield. And with the permafrost melting, there isn't enough structural support, so those power poles are going to come down eventually. It's a really serious problem that's impacting infrastructure, but there just aren't enough votes. So while the government, it's important to be seen to be addressing these issues that especially the Trudeau government has made a kind of a core part of their mandate, in terms of the actual follow through, the ensuring that they're effective and moving through and getting executed on the ground, is they don't really gain from the politics of that, because it'll win them voters. It might win them the voters there, but it's those voters, the population's so small, it's a drop in the bucket for this enormous territory. So that's kind of the to look at it from an economic model, the incentives don't align in terms of the return on investment. If you're thinking like bringing government programs to Toronto, right, gets you if there's a 1-to-1 ratio of buying votes, like increasing government programs. Obviously, this is just hypothetical. That's not how it really works. But the return on investment in terms of the cost per voter in the North is exponentially higher. So the economic incentives politically don't align. And that's a really serious problem. But I've got to say, the federal government has really stepped up quite a lot in the last, even just since I've been at ARF in the last 5 or 6 years. The communities have much more say in how money is spent, which is excellent. There's still some serious problems in terms of the structure, like universities, when they apply for government grants, they've got whole departments. They have departments that specialize in grant writing, or at the very least, they have professors and admin people who have tons of experience and have students that can work under them. They have all this capacity to apply for grants and then to administer grants and report on them, do those things. A lot of these communities, there's about 75 communities in the Canadian Arctic, and their population ranges from, less than 100 to like 1,500, 2,000, 3,000, maybe like, depending on how far south you're going. If you're going subarctic, significantly more than that. But like Joe Haven, I think is about 1,200 to go for a typical Arctic community. But a lot of them will have like one, if any, full-time admin staff, right? But then so the government might announce a community. You're in charge of this new. We're downloading the as you've been requesting, like the Nunavut has just had responsibility for its lands downloaded from the federal government to them. That's something and the Northwest Territories have done that a long time ago. But the DFO, different government departments, are still very involved in a lot of it. But then now the Trudeau government has been putting more of those funds directly in the hands of the community. But to access those funds, they still need to go through the federal funding structures. But they might only have one admin person, and the funding that they might get $200 million to do this environmental work, say water monitoring, ensuring let's just say water monitoring, just for the sake of argument. They get $10 million for water monitoring. I'll say that, but they only have one person who's an admin person, and they've never applied for a federal government grant before. Or maybe they do know how to do it, but they still have to do the day-to-day business of the work. And the government, those $10 million generally will have no money allocated to hire more admin people. It will have no money allocated for training on how to go through these systems. And they are really complicated. Getting government grants and just even the reporting when you do get them is a full-time job and much more than that. It's unbelievable how difficult the procurement rules can be. So there needs to be changes to these funding structures. So one, the administrative burden is lessened, that there's exceptions made for, when things are in the north, like things are more expensive in the north. As far as I know, NSERC is the only government agency that has a specific northern top-up for their funds. So if you apply for ship time in the south, you get a certain amount. If you apply for ship time in the north, you get a certain amount plus a certain percentage, because it's much more expensive to run ships in the Arctic. Most government departments, most funding doesn't have there's no extra pay, even though it can cost 3, 4, 5, sometimes 10 times more to work up there. But yeah, so there needs to be more money for it, and the administrative burden needs to be lessened, but there also needs to be training and money for capacity building, for especially around administration of government grants and government funding, so that these communities can access these funds and get them out the door. Because just because the government has announced $200 million in funding doesn't mean that's money getting spent. And they can make the announcement, it looks good, they get all the credit for it, and then 3 years down the line, who's going to go check whether any of that money was actually spent or not? And in many cases, unfortunately, it's not getting spent. So they get both benefits. They get the announcement saying the money's going out the door, but then the Treasury, the money's still in the vault. So you still have that in your balance sheet moving forward. So it's now. All that said, I do think the government generally does mean well and has done a lot in terms of reconciliation and in terms of bringing more funding to specific projects and ensuring that communities have a say in how that's spent, and ensuring that any science projects now, you have to have consultation. You don't get funding if you haven't proved if you can't prove that you haven't done the consultation and collaboration. Still a lot of work that needs to be done. But what it really comes down to is looking at it from an incentive, microeconomic perspective. The votes aren't there for the benefit of the politicians in terms of re-election. To look at it in a very crass political lens. And that's not about this government. That's about any government.
Even let's say, provided that it was not about the vote bank, right? Let's say if we remove that just for a second, even then,
Yep.
it's like first, all these large organizations, they have huge sales and procurement teams. So that part, and then the second part, the reporting part, like you mentioned, is a full-time job. I mean, for organizations trying to make an impact in these areas, you're just unnecessarily taxing them from a whole bunch of different layers.
Oh yeah. Yeah, it's really difficult. And I mean, the other thing too is like even take politics out of it, just in terms of what you're thinking about. Like Great Slave Lake, which is one of the in the Northwest Territories, it's Yellowknife, Hay River, and a whole bunch of other communities. It's crucially important. It's an incredible ecosystem. It flows into the Beaufort Sea, which is part of the Arctic Ocean. And it's one of the most fascinating lakes. It's barely had any research papers published on it. Lake Winnipeg, which is an important lake, has hundreds and hundreds and hundreds and is undergoing constant monitoring. Our ship on Great Slave Lake had to be dry docked for the past 3 years because there wasn't enough funding to pay for it to go out to keep it going consistently and we subsidize it heavily, but it still was it was so expensive to run and there was so little funding that we would have had to shut our doors if we just had it going out. And there weren't enough science projects anyway, because there just wasn't the funding for it. But no cabinet minister, or at least no cabinet ministers that I know of, have a cottage on Great Slave Lake. That's a little bit different with Lake Winnipeg, Lake Ontario, the Southern Great Lakes. It's just it's not through any ill will. It's not because they're thinking I have a cabin on this lake and I need to do it. It's just because that's what they're exposed to, right? They're in the South. They're thinking about it more. There's constituents asking for. It's a lot easier for someone who lives on Lake Ontario to get to Ottawa than it is for someone who lives on Great Slave Lake, right? One other thing that's really important to know is that a key part of the Arctic National Strategy that we wrote, I talked about the funding structures, but the other thing is the government needs a holistic strategy. It needs a holistic strategy for dealing with for the future of the Arctic, for ensuring prosperity, economic development, environmental sustainability, reconciliation, all of those key issues. We don't have one. But more important, and a big part of the problem with that is that the departments aren't mandated to work cross-departmentally. So DFO doesn't have to work with the Navy or the Coast Guard or Agriculture Canada. They're not mandated to work together. In the United States, where they have a much smaller slice of the Arctic, but they have a full strategy for the Arctic that mandates all departments have to work cross-departmentally. And that means that they know what each other's up to. It means they can combine funding to save money on projects instead of doing like all this piecemeal siloed approach. And unfortunately, that's the way that a lot of things are done right now in the North. And the Inuit and Northern Indigenous people, they understand this. They take a whole of ecosystem approach. They see that, this one little animal is going to have ripple effects all throughout the food chain. Whereas so many science projects, and part of the reason why ARF, we have an interdisciplinary approach because we try to mirror the organizations we work with. We get very little. We just kind of started to get a small amount of funding from Environment and Climate Change Canada for one specific project in Great Slave Lake. Then that's the only federal funding we get at all right now, and we hadn't gotten any for years before that. But it is part of the reason why it's so hard for us to get funding is because we have that interdisciplinary approach, and the government doesn't like to work that way. They like to go, no, we want to know how this one individual type of phytoplankton is changing over this 3-year period in this one little geographic area. And instead, it's got to be broader than that to really get an understanding. And that's what people who live in the North understand, and it's something that we need to adjust in the South as well, and why we need a strategy to do that.
What can Canadians who are not exposed to this, how can they get involved, or what are the things where they can begin? Obviously, that would be one part of the question. And then the second piece I would love, and then this is where we can sort of wrap up, is now you did mention funding sources. Now, even though, ARF was started by, the ex-Blackberry guy and Jim and Tim. So what are the different ways that you stay funded to continue these projects outside of the government?
Yeah, sure. Well, I can quickly answer that. So as I think I mentioned it before, but the board gives us funding to our kind of core admin funding, like my salary would come from that. And then the projects, we go out and we find funding for that. And a lot of the time that is by our ships. a university will hire our ship to do science work, and we get cost recovery through that. We charge as little as we possibly can, and we subsidize the cost where we can. Or we'll get funding specifically from a government. Like we held youth elder camps in Tuktoyaktuk and Joe-Haven. National Geographic funded those, and then there was a bunch of science, and there's going to be a documentary and thing that come out of that. But then we also try to do, where we can, we'll do commercial projects that are related to our mandate, like we did this work in the Kativik and Makivik region in Nunavik, which is in northern Quebec. If people aren't familiar with Nunavik, and we did hydrographic mapping. We basically mapped the seabed so that fiber optic cable for internet could reach those communities, and many of these communities that had no internet whatsoever, completely inaccessible. We'd have people go visit, and we basically would hear from them once they got to a community that had service. So it's pretty crazy, the difference, because fiber optic cables have already started to go in, and have been completed in a couple of instances. So commercial projects like that, we can take funds from those to subsidize the other science projects. So that's how our model works. In terms of what people can do, you can always donate if people feel so inclined. But I think what's more important is getting involved politically. And I don't mean in terms of partisan politics. I mean, writing your MP, writing ministers, writing the prime minister, writing opposition leaders, sending them a letter. They read those. It really works. I used to work in human rights advocacy. Nothing scares a politician more than suddenly getting a whole bunch of emails or calls from their constituents on a single issue. When they see that, they really take notice. So reading up on reconciliation, reading up on the cogeneration of knowledge approaches, things like the OCAP principle, OCAP, OCAP principles, looking at ITK, which is the kind of the AFN for the Inuit, or other regional organizations like the Kitikmeot Inuit Association or the Inuvialuit Settlement Region. Looking at that stuff, traveling north also is good. You know, the people, there's the tourism industry is growing, and it's a really incredible place to go to, and I'd really recommend that everybody head up and visit the north, because the Inuit are and northern Indigenous peoples are incredibly welcoming, and the communities are really truly amazing. But yeah, and if you want to get involved, probably the highest impact thing that anyone can do is familiarize yourself, do the reading, and then get in touch with your politicians and tell them, hey, we need to start really seriously funding science in the north, and we need to start adjusting these structures. The Arctic National Strategy is also available on our website. If you go to arcticfocus.org and then click go to the About Us section, you can scroll down to the bottom and find the Arctic National Strategy. So, and that's just a draft. It's meant to be, we don't have our name on it. It's just given to politicians so they can build off of it, shovel-ready projects that we came up with, and policy changes in collaboration with the communities where we work. But all of those things will be good. The Arctic National Strategy is probably a good place to start if people want to familiarize themselves kind of more generally. Any little bit of involvement can really make a big difference. Reading on advocacy works. Reaching out to politicians really works. If you want to raise the issue, if you care about the Arctic, if you care about the environment, send an email, call your MP. That stuff really does make a big difference.
Right. Every drop counts. So the activity is 3001 questions all about me. So you just pick a number between 1 and 3001.
Okay. 777.
700. Okay. Has there been something that, by the way, you would be reading this question, so I'm just kind of reading it on your behalf.
Right.
Has there been something that I've never wanted to do, but have always encouraged to do?
Oh God, that's hard. That's a really tough question.
That's where we end the conversation today.
Yeah, wow, that's a really hard one. I don't know. I mean, because the stuff, like, I encourage people to do all kinds of things, but here's one thing that I heard, because I knew it was a piece of really useful advice, and it doesn't apply to me. So this probably isn't what they're looking for, but I think it technically fills the criteria, which is, if you have migraines, look into taking triptans to address them, because I know a few people, including my wife, who recently started taking triptans for migraines, and like that, it fixed it. So, and a couple of people that I've spoken to who have migraines hadn't heard about it. That's something that a guy I know mentioned it to me. I mentioned it to my wife. She mentioned it to our doctor, and it's cured a pretty serious problem. So, yeah, if you have migraines, try triptans. That's something I don't get migraines, so it doesn't apply to me. But it's a piece of advice for other people.
Really well handled. Really good response. Thank you, Tom. I really appreciate you. This was a lot of fun, and hopefully I can have you back in sometime in the future.
Yeah, my pleasure. Thanks a lot, Paul.
Bye.
Take care.